Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, February 21st, day 504 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here in our Jerusalem offices with our diplomatic reporter, Laser Berman. Hi, Laser. Thanks for joining me today.
Good to be back here.
We are here for a Friday Focus. What number Friday Focus is this, Laser?
By my count, this is our sixth.
And may there be many, many more.
Yeah, let's get those numbers up there. Let's do it.
For sure. So, listeners, today is a bit of a liminal day. Yesterday, we saw the return of 4 slain hostages from Gaza, and tomorrow we're expecting to see the release of 6 living male hostages. And please check out another daily briefing tomorrow for a full report on that. But in the meantime, we are going to turn and spin the globe a little bit and look at a different conflict in order to learn some lessons and see what could be in store for Israel. Because all signs, Laser, seem to increasingly be pointing to Israel attempting to at least wrap up the war in Gaza. So we're going to look at another conflict that is occurring right now. And I'm talking about the Ukraine war, which is also in a similar situation in which it appears there's a lot of push-pull, of course, that it appears that the war could be starting to wrap up there. So we're going to hear what's happening on the ground and learn about the war's goals versus the narratives that have been told about it in the past 3 years. And actually, is it 3 years, or should we really be starting from 2014? So we'll discuss all this and much, much more when we're back. Now, Laser, I have to admit that since October 7th, 2023, I've been much more occupied with our own war here in Israel on so many different fronts, obviously, and I've kind of lost track of what was happening in Ukraine. So it's very much, again, in the news, of course, because U.S. President Donald Trump is trying to start talks with Russia. And of course, there was on Monday this emergency meeting of European leaders to make sure that they're all on board and understand what their perspectives are. So just to begin with, I'd like to kind of zoom out, discuss when, of course, the war actually did begin. Is it 3 years ago, or is it more 2014, as I mentioned in the intro?
Sure. And I think I'd even go earlier. I think we can start in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolves. The former republics of the USSR become independent, and they have to start making their own way and charting their own course in the world. Ukraine had Soviet nuclear weapons in 1994. It agreed to get rid of them for guaranteed by both Russia, the US, and other countries in Budapest in 94, that their territorial integrity would be guaranteed by these countries. It continued to be largely in the Russian sphere. Over time, its citizens increasingly wanted connections with the West, and there was anger and protests over the idea that elections were being rigged in the favor of the pro-Russian candidates. This really came to a head in early 2014, the Euromaidan protests in Kyiv, when the public made as clear as possible that they did not accept the direction that the government was going, that they wanted to join the EU, they wanted to be pro-Western, and they did not see it acceptable that the government was canceling or moving away from those promises. The Russians responded by annexing the Crimean Peninsula, which in southern Ukraine, and then shortly afterward, the 2 provinces in eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russians said that they had, that the will of the people there was to break away, and Russian forces moved in to quote unquote protect the Russian speaking, the ethnic Russians there. But that was seen broadly by the West as just an invasion. And since 2014, there had been this mostly low-level conflict between Russia and Ukraine focused on those eastern provinces, not a lot of movement. In 2021, really things started picking up again with Russian threats, and then you get to early 2022, it becomes very clear that Russians are planning something. There was a lot of warnings in the West, and there was a troop buildup. February 24th, 2022. So we're a few days away from the 3rd anniversary. That was when there was the major invasion by Russian forces, what Putin called a special military operation. He said he didn't want to occupy the country, just wanted to, quote unquote, denazify it of its government led by a Jewish president, and shortly before, and also a Jewish prime minister. And there was the expectation in the West, me too, that this would be a very short war, that the Ukrainians would not be able to stand up to it, that the government headed by Volodymyr Zelenskyy would go into exile, or Zelenskyy himself would be killed if he stayed. And that turned out not to be true. Though the Russians poured in on multiple axes from the south, from the west, from the northwest, and most threateningly from the north to the outskirts of Kyiv, the Ukrainians succeeded in stopping them. And within weeks started turning the tide, and then were able by the summer of 2024 to go onto their own offensive, basically kick the Russian troops back. That whole offensive into Kyiv was totally turned around, and start to really make gains. In 2023, it was a year of expectation that Ukraine might be able to actually win this war, and they tried to go on the offensive, and that's when they really had a increasing Western support. They continue to say throughout that they need more advanced weapons, and Europe, and especially the Biden administration, was very slow. They would say they wouldn't release a certain weapon system. With time, they would, but it was always very slow and very frustrating for the Ukrainians. But that all kind of culminated and petered out. And over the past year, it has been an increasingly bad year for the Ukrainians, a better year for the Russians. But what is a better year for the Russians? I think over the course of the year, they've been able to take something like 25 miles at a huge cost, mostly in the basically in the east of the country, pushing west. That's where the focus of the war is now. So you say you've lost track of really what's happening there, because there has not been a ton happening. There hasn't been very much that's really dramatic. It's been a war of attrition now. Very heavy in lost materiel, certainly to personnel. So it's been a grind, but Russian forces continue to push forward. There's a little bit of a push around Kharkiv too, but that doesn't seem to be threatening that city. And there's also there was a Ukrainian offensive last year into the Kursk area. The Russians have pushed it back somewhat, but Ukrainian forces are still there. So that's basically where the conflict is largely frozen and is not working. What is important now? There's a question about which side will be able to outlast the other one. Russia is a much bigger country, bigger economy, more manpower, but it does have serious manpower issues. It has started to use thousands of North Korean troops, has started all sorts of ways to get more people enlisted in the army, and its economy is certainly not in good shape, though it's not about to collapse. Ukraine also has trouble enlisting, but its manpower, it's not in a critical manpower shortage. It doesn't really use its manpower that well. There's not full desire, even close to that, to join the army. Probably if the army operated better, more people would be willing to. But the real strategic issue for Ukraine is the type of weaponry it gets from the West, primarily the United States, and the amount of funding it gets. That's what can keep Ukraine in the war. I think Ukraine does not need anyone to fight for it as long as it gets the full funding. But we'll talk about this with the Trump administration coming in. That has totally changed the future prospects for Ukrainian funding for the war and Ukraine's ability to continue to prosecute this war.
I would say, alongside all of the battles and all of the land taking and loss that you've been discussing, there's also a really huge war of narratives. Now, for us living here in Israel, we live alongside over 1 million Russian-speaking immigrants who came from the 1990s and on. And until the Ukraine war, everyone kind of said that they were Russian, right? And then immediately in 2014, as you said, when there was this burst of nationalism in Ukraine, all of a sudden we started realizing that some of these Russians were actually Ukrainians. And then again in 2022, when the buildup and the big invasion started, this happened again. And so it is a big question to me about the narratives, meaning Russia, it seems to be saying, is releasing or freeing or protecting their ethnic Russians or Russian-speaking people who kind of got all scattered around during the Soviet Union collective, right? And then Ukraine, on it for its part, is saying, no, we're its own nation. We are independent. We want to fight for our own independence, and we need the help of Western society in order to do that. So the big question, I think, is what does Western society / powers, what do they have to gain by allowing for this war to continue or by funding this war? What is the interest here?
It's a very good question. Depends who you ask, because there's not any objective one set of interests here. Let's say the Democratic Party, members of the Republican Party, generally before Trump came into office, not everyone, and the mainline European thinking that is in opposition to the Trump administration is that this is a war. This is the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. It is a fight of a flawed democracy, but a democracy, and one that orients itself toward the West against a brutal autocratic ruler, Vladimir Putin, who is in alliance in different levels with all the anti-Western powers, so increasing cooperation with China, dependent on Iran for key weapons, obviously a key backer of the fallen Assad regime, and a regime that jails or kills internal dissidents and wants to reestablish its influence, its illiberal influence over much of Europe, certainly Eastern Europe, and uses all sorts of underhanded, illegal, and sometimes brutal techniques to get its narrative into the Western world. That's why around the first Trump election, there was all the talk about Russia interference in elections, but other countries have also faced similar challenges. They say many countries say that if we don't, focus on the fight and make sure we don't lose the fight in Ukraine, then other countries will be next, and perhaps much of Europe will be next. So certainly countries like Poland and the Baltic states feel like it's very real that they could face a Russian invasion at some point. And they say, okay, it's worth it to continue to fund this war. It's cheaper than us fighting ourselves, obviously. And we have to show Putin that there is cost and that he can't just keep rolling through, and that we have to deter him from any further expanded use of power. And therefore, we need the United States to back this. Right? The NATO only works with United States funding and capabilities, and without the U.S., it's not going to work. If I could say let's say the Trump, let's call it that, an isolationist policy, it's that, first of all, this is a massive investment of nearing like $200 billion now of U.S. money. For what exactly? It's not like we have crazy interests in Ukraine. If anything, that's really important. It's bad for Ukraine. It's bad for Russia. It's a suck on the European economy as well. I think what also would really get people that think this, passionate, is that the Europeans have talked about how vital this is for Europe and it's existential in many ways, yet they want the U.S. to fund it. They are very slow in getting their own defense spending up. They're obviously not going to fight the war themselves. They even generally are not committed to putting Ukraine into NATO, because that would mean that they would immediately have to go fight it if the deterrence is actually going to work and if they're going to follow Article 5. So it seems like there's a lot of hypocrisy there, at least the way that, and I think there is hypocrisy. So that, I think those are the major narratives. Of course, Trump took this narrative further in the past week when he called, first of all, he sent senior representatives to talk to the Russians in Saudi Arabia without Ukrainian or European participation, which really upset the Europeans and the Ukrainians, obviously. And the fact that he's now personally attacking Zelenskyy as a dictator, as someone that has like 4% of support, which is not true. And it could get worse, right? The Russians try to portray him as part of this pro-Nazi, neo-Nazi, Ukrainian nationalist movement that has taken over a country that doesn't want to be taken over them, harkening back to Ukrainian policies during the Holocaust. So that is I hope that Trump doesn't go in that direction, but he seems to currently have in his ear people that are pushing this idea that the Europeans are ungrateful, they're unreliable, and they can't do anything themselves. So why should the U.S. be suckers? That seems to be the narrative.
Right. And we saw on Monday, as I said, this emergency meeting, and it was called by Macron. It was held in Paris. And it was really fascinating to me, as somebody who really is not, expert in any of this, to see this very strange alliance, shall we say, between France and Britain, all of a sudden, both of them pushing for something that is in their neighborhood, but not really in their neighborhood. As you said, I can understand when Poland is making some kind of statement because they are directly affected by this war. I can understand with any of the bordering countries. But when we get to Britain, for example, who decided not to be part of Europe anymore, let's not forget that. What is Britain's interest here in maintaining this war?
So there's the kind of the bigger vision based on values of what kind of world we want to see, who do we want to be ascendant. Do we want a rules-based liberal international order dominated by the West, which means dominated by the United States? Or do we want one where it's kind of a multipolar world where regimes like Putin's or China are able to dominate their areas and tamp down on the rights of people? And there's also movements within Europe. I think you saw this at the Munich Security Conference, where you saw the anger on European officials' face when you had Vice President J.D. Vance kind of lecturing them about keeping down the popular will, quote unquote. That there are movements that are quite kind of anti-liberal, some are even pro-Russian within Europe, and that makes European leadership very, very uncomfortable. But it's not really that far. You think about, Europe is not. It's mostly small countries. So what Russia does in Ukraine reaches into Central Europe, and if it goes any further, then it starts getting toward Western Europe. It affects everything. It certainly affected fuel. It affected economy. It will absolutely have effect. This war is within Europe. So, because Britain is not in the EU anymore, it's still a key member of NATO, and its trading partners are its leading trading partners besides the United States around the continent. So this is certainly in British interest. Germany obviously is also very much involved there, and a lot of the smaller countries as well.
Germany is, of course, heading to elections on Sunday. And so do you think that if, for example, the coalition changes up, which I think it's pretty much expected or a given that it will, that Germany's stance will change in any way towards Russia/Ukraine?
It's hard to predict right now. It depends how the AfD, that far-right party that's been so controversial, how well they do. I imagine no one's going to want to sit with them. So it depends what alliance shakes out, but I imagine it'll be basically the same. But in general, Europe has this question ahead of it, facing it, right? So if the US is not such a reliable backer anymore, what kind of European policy goes forward now? How can they take a future vision for Europe forward, especially on security? And this is the issue that will mold it. There's been talks about kind of individual countries giving promises of some sort of troop deployments to Ukraine, not in combat roles, but kind of guaranteeing this peace. But the question is whether Europe writ large is able or is willing to start taking responsibility for its own security, ideally in partnership with the United States, but not dependent on the United States. Even if these countries were going to commit tens of thousands of troops, they would still need to rely on U.S. capabilities in key areas to be able to carry out extended military operations. So they really will have to start beefing up their own security and spending much more and making hard decisions, because it's been decades where a lot of European countries were able to fund very generous social welfare programs because they did not have to spend that much on security. Here in Israel, we spend a lot on security, and we know taxes are high and prices are high, and we get decent social welfare, but we're missing a lot. We don't have like Northern European. And obviously the US is very different too. And they spend a lot on security as well. So the Europeans are going to have to make some tough choices about their future. It's going to be, I think, the dominant political issue in Europe moving forward. And I think it's certainly not comfortable for them, because they would rather, have NATO commitments, which means US commitments. And that's also what Ukraine wants. if Ukraine had a NATO commitment, if it was part of NATO, it would mean that it would be basically putting the problem of deterring Russia and guaranteeing its security to NATO, which means to the United States. The US is saying we don't want to do that. The European countries that are trying to deter Russia, think of a way to deter Russia. Let's say there's an agreement, right? You need that agreement to last. If it's an agreement that, let's say, Trump is able to hammer out that's acceptable to the Ukrainians, to the Russians, no guarantee that that will happen. But if it's an agreement that is seen as something that will crumple in a couple of years, will be war again, who is going to invest in this Ukrainian state? How are they going to start building up their economy and developing their own ability to deter Russia? They won't. So if the Europeans are trying to deter Russia by themselves, I think it's not going to be a very effective deterrence, right? They certainly were not willing to commit troops to the war right now. Is Russia really going to believe, if there's a reignition of this war, that they're going to commit in the future? It's hard to believe. So I think Europe really has to make a tough decision about what it's willing to do in terms of fighting and what kind of investments it's going to make. Probably the most effective investment would be to build up Ukrainian capacity, Ukrainian capabilities, because that's the most effective deterrent. But that will also take decisions, and will take also smarter decisions by the Ukrainians about how they want to handle their own economy and their own military moving forward.
Okay, so since we are the Times of Israel, I now want to slightly tilt the globe and look at all of this through an Israeli perspective. So, first of all, there's the Jews of Ukraine and the Jews of Russia, and many thousands have immigrated to Israel over the course of the past 3 years, not to mention since 2014, not to mention since the 1990s, of course. So that's one factor, an influx in immigration of these Russian-speaking / Ukrainian Jews that came to Israel. But let's take it in a different direction. How has Israel aided / abetted or ignored the Ukrainian war in general?
It's a good question. So the Aliyah has not been that big from, let's say, Ukraine. I know better. It's probably say it's around 20,000.
It's still the highest number of immigrants coming from anywhere around the world for years in succession. It's the greatest number of immigrants are coming from Ukraine or Russia versus anywhere else in the world.
Right, but still not that many, right? So if you think about 300,000, it's hard to say exactly, but let's say somewhere around 300,000 Jews before 2022. Something like 20,000 came to Israel. Some have left. It's not that many. About 150,000 at some point left Ukraine also for Germany, the US, other parts of Europe. Some have come back. Let's not forget that there's still a ban on men. I think it's from 18 to 60, but it's around that. It's basically men who are vaguely in fighting age that can't leave. So that keeps a lot of the men there, and then a lot of their families. So the Jewish community still there, thriving, but it certainly has lost a lot of its members, some permanently, some temporarily. Israel, going back, Israeli leaders, and including Netanyahu himself, have had very good relations with Putin over the years. It was basically the only Western country, truly Western country, that was not seen by the Russians as anti-Russian. So the European countries, the US, Canada, Britain, were all seen as kind of having this deep bias against Russia, and Israel wasn't. It has a lot of Russian speakers. It has prominent Russian speakers in government, and it has ties. And when Israeli leaders would go there, they would bring fluent Russian speakers along, and they developed very good relationships. It's also an important country in the Middle East. It is allied very closely with a lot of our enemies, but the idea was, especially in Syria, where Russia had military, air and naval bases, the idea was we want to maintain a productive relationship with Russia so that we can do what we want against Iran and Hezbollah in Russia, and that in Syria, and that generally works. In my estimation, Israel was a little bit too cowardly. We're much more powerful than Russia in the Middle East, right? So our fear of upsetting the Russians, I think, was a little bit overblown, but that's what the idea was. When the war in Ukraine started, or the full invasion started in 2022, what Israeli leaders tried to do, so this was under the Bennett-Lapid government, they condemned it verbally. So Lapid kind of took the anti-Russian line. Bennett was much more quiet about it. Maintain an open dialogue with Russia. So on human rights and humanitarian issues, Israel was very prominent in backing Ukraine, but avoided defense support. So wouldn't give key systems, certainly no offensive weapons, but even the defensive weapon systems that they were asking throughout, they would ask for Iron Dome. Iron Dome itself is pretty irrelevant. I think, Ukraine's a huge country. It was kind of a code name or stand-in for Israel's multi-layered air defense, which would be very helpful for Ukraine. Israel has not provided that. What Israel did provide was a civil warning system, some elements of it. I believe it was to the Kyiv region that would allow them to have more targeted civil air sirens like we have here. Because in Ukraine, it's very broad. So, people can ignore them because it's not that targeted. There were American Patriot missiles, I believe, that were here that we allowed the Americans, we gave the green light, no problem, to send to Ukraine, again, defensive. But beyond that, we have not provided any open defense support. I would imagine we've cooperated on intelligence, especially on drones, since we're both facing Iranian drones. But that has not been confirmed openly. It's just my speculation. It would make a lot of sense. But Ukraine has openly pushed for more cooperation and has been disappointed by it. Relations between Israel and Ukraine are generally pretty good, though. Now, if you look at the past few months, Netanyahu and Zelenskyy spoke by phone. In Munich, where Foreign Minister Gideon Sar was, he met with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister. Herzog spoke with Zelenskyy, so the ties are there. The conversation is there. I was in Ukraine in early 2023 with Eli Cohen, Foreign Minister. So we were in Kyiv. We took a train there. So the relationship is there. Ukraine has backed our war against Hamas very strongly. They haven't given us problems about humanitarian aid or the way we're targeting. They've been, rhetorically, they've been great. So, the potential is there, but it doesn't look like there's any major change. The sense I get, and I'm not taking this just out of the air, is that in these meetings, the main Ukrainian request from Israel was to help them with the Trump administration. I wouldn't imagine Israel did much, but certainly wasn't effective if Israel did try to, because you see where the Trump administration is now. That is really what Israel can offer, not only Ukraine, but they can also offer this to Europe. Let's not forget, right? If Israel really want to think big, and I'm not sure that the leadership here is thinking like this, but they could say to, France, Germany, Italy, the UK, countries that have been, especially France during this war, our war against Hamas, they've been not always so reliable, that we'll go to bat for Europe, Ukraine, and we'll try to move the dial in the Trump administration. If you can help us with what we're facing now, which is, let's get Hamas out of Gaza. Let's deal with the Iranian threat. Let's make sure Hezbollah doesn't rearm. So I think that there is that potential. I really don't think that it's going to happen, though. But then there's also second order effects. If Europe understands that it needs to rearm and become societies that maybe go back to the draft, as some are starting to, they need domestic production. They need these capabilities that they're missing. Israel can certainly be a big part of that. And also we need, or part of this emerging order after October 7th envisions European troops around. So UNIFIL, we want French and Italian and capable troops, and we don't want Nepalese, Fiji. No offense to these wonderful countries, but they're not the ones that we expect to go to, to actually carry out serious military operations against Hezbollah. We need them to have enough troops available to be here in force. And if they have to commit troops to Europe, then that might not be the case. So there are certainly other effects that this could have on the region.
Let's talk a little bit more specifically about Israel's relationship with Russia, which has been host to some of the summits between, for example, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. So where do you see Russia in terms of, if we're looking at, again, the idea that Israel may be wrapping up its war as well, where do you see Russia playing into that?
Russia's not anti-Israel itself. It has certainly anti-Semitic elements, the way that a lot of its leaders speak, certainly society, but that has not translated into, I don't think that's the reason for its hostile stance at times and its backing of our enemies. I think it does that because its fundamental position is anti-American. It, like China, wants to push back on the American-dominated order that it feels is unfair to it. It will promote anyone that it feels can help push back on that. And the anti-American forces in the Middle East are the anti-Israeli forces, right? So if it's Syria, if it's Iran, if it's Palestinians, other terrorist groups, that's where it sees that it is able to. So it wants less American influence in the Middle East and more Russian influence. And then China obviously has its own interest there as well, but they're somewhat different. So I think that's going to continue throughout. Are we going to give anything to Russia? I don't think so. But I think the fact that we're not backing Ukraine more is something that we have been giving to Russia throughout. And, given it looks like they have their own avenues to the Trump administration now, so they don't really need us for that. It would have been nice if, as Naftali Bennett tried to do, if in order to get the two sides talking to each other, we could, but they don't need that. Trump likes to talk to people directly. As we said last time, he's talking to Putin. Israel was not able to be a neutral ground for peace talks between Russia and Ukraine like we want it to be. Turkey actually got that, and then some other places as well, but we have not. So we're not a meaningful player in this war, and Russia is largely shut out from certainly anything that happens in Gaza. But in the broader Middle East right now, they're not especially dominant either.
So when I look at this Russian-Ukraine conflict, I kind of have flashbacks of my childhood. I'm a bit older than you. I'm almost 50. And I remember, of course, the whole Red Scare narrative in the US. And I just wonder how much of Trump is still in that mindset. Do you see that happening as well in terms of just the rhetoric and the storytelling that's going on right now between the US and Russia?
No, for Trump, I don't think so, because his focus is on the Ukrainian threat, but he's blasting Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians. The focus more on Trump's narrative is certainly the Chinese threat, which was not dominant, in the Cold War, and this general unfairness to the U.S. taxpayer, to the U.S. worker. So it's a very different narrative. Yeah, I don't think we're going back to that at all. If the U.S. wasn't afraid of the Russian threat, like many in America are, but not that this administration, then I think we'd see a very different policy in Ukraine.
Really interesting stuff, Laser. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus, also our daily briefing. Please check out another installment of the daily briefing tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.